If you're a younger American, all you can do is imagine a time when a single income at a regular job, and I do mean a regular job, not some special high-paying job, meant that you could support a family. You could buy a car, you could buy a house, you could take the family on a 3-week vacation every year. You could put your kids through college, you could even save for retirement. And if you were working for one of the larger companies, those retirement benefits were fabulous. It's hard to imagine that degree of prosperity for the regular people. But that was America from the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s. The crash began just after 1974 and accelerated after 1981. I'm from the young side of Gen X, born in 1976. Because of my background coming from the most remote areas of Bush, Alaska, I joined the ordinary labor force a little later on in life. I was working from a young age, but not the kind of things that registered on America's labor pool. So I got married at 30 and joined the ordinary world. And so while culturally I relate more to Gen X, economically I relate more to the millennials. So it makes it 2006, right around the onset of the Great Recession, that I joined the ordinary American economy. So for me, like millions of other Americans, we can only imagine a time when working hard, putting in your time, following the rules would result in great economic prosperity. That was no longer a thing for those of us who joined the labor force post-Reaganomics. We hear the 1950s and 1960s idolized, and while there were still a lot of social issues going on, being battled out with civil rights and so forth, from an economic position, it was a golden age. For the American working class, it was the golden age. Nothing else even comes close. But what's funny is the people who so often idolize the 1950s and 60s seldom do this for its economic value. Instead, they idolize the social aspects of the era. Which is strange because so many of the people didn't even have basic rights. But hey, if you are white and male, it was great. But anyway, what were some of the leading elements that brought us to that golden era of financial prosperity for Americans? Now, there's a lot of pieces to this, but let's take a look at some of the key elements. And those things exist regardless of your belief systems in economic systems. This has become such a problem for how we analyze economics today. They are become so wrapped up in ideological dogmas that factual evaluation is nearly absent. That happens when a theory becomes a belief system, and make no mistake, economics is largely a belief system. So in the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s, we had a minimum wage when adjusted to inflation is over $20 today. And I don't care how you feel about the minimum wage, and how your economic philosophy may say there should be no minimum wage. This is what happened. This is cause and effect. We had a very high minimum wage in relation to inflation during that same period when we had this great middle class prosperity. We also had a progressive tax code, which placed the majority of the tax burden on the most wealthy and on corporate America. Ronald Reagan is often remembered for cutting taxes, but in actuality, this is a false analysis of what Reagan did. Taxes weren't so much cut as they were moved. The tax burden was shifted off the highest percentile in corporate America and placed onto the working class. And just like the minimum wage, I really don't care what you think about on taxes or what your ideal tax system might be. This is still what happened. Reaganomics also included the rise of corporate welfare, where the money would go to the top 1% and it was supposed to trickle down to the rest of the nation. This was a complete reversal of the 1950s through 1970s economic model. Again, it doesn't matter what your economic philosophy is, these are the events that took place. This is cause and effect. How you might feel about the cause and that effect doesn't change the cause or the effect. Reagan shifted the tax burden off of the wealthiest and placed it onto the working class, and also placed it onto debt, which accelerates inflation, which most adversely affects the working class. Ronald Reagan became the first U.S. president to add $1 trillion to our national debt. $1 trillion might not sound like much today, but in 1980 it was huge. Nothing says conservative quite the same as being the biggest spender ever in our nation's history. We also added strong labor unions back then. Those great manufacturing jobs, those great industry jobs, also were all unionized labor, and they had a lot of clout. Those labor unions contracts were directly responsible for those great retirement plans, health insurance plans, and those summer vacations that were now something of legend. So what happened? The political powers busted up the unions, passed laws to restrict voluntary labor cooperation and limit labor contracts. The tax burden was taken off the wealthiest and placed onto the working class, and the minimum wage stagnated. All of these things were done in the name of an economic model that was claimed to be built upon sound scientific theory, sound economic theory, sound economic science. But economic science has to be scientific, right? A scientific theory must be applied to an experiment and determined to be an actual reality. This is how scientific theory becomes scientific fact, through tests, through implementation. This is how the process of science works. We were told that these economic scientists, that minimum wage and labor unions and high taxes on the wealthy were stifling the American economy, and if these rules were changed to benefit the corporations, there would be a huge economic boom. Well, that was partly correct. There was an economic boom, but under this model, the vast majority of that prosperity went to the top fraction of the top 1%. And the working class, the people who provided the labor to get this job done, well, they got fucked. And what do these same economic scientists tell us today when we look back at this 50 years of failure? They tell us we didn't implement their ideas hard enough. We need to cut taxes on the wealthy even more. Of course, they never cut the spending, which means greater inflation and greater burden on the working class. They tell us we need to even further cut the power of organized labor. And we need to eliminate minimum wage requirements. And if we do these things even harder than we did in the last 50 years that resulted in failure, it's going to result in great economic success. Now, why does this remind me so much of the people who advocate for failed communist models? And when they're confronted with the failure of those models, they say, well, it wasn't real communism. Any idea is only as sound as its implementation. And I have heard and understood the reasons why they say they were failed communist economic systems. That bad people and greedy people manipulated to destroy their noble goals. But here's the hard reality. If your system is so susceptible to evil manipulation, it's not a valid system. Bad people will always be with us. You can't create a system based upon the idea that they're not going to exist. Bad people and greedy people will always be with us, and they will always find their ways into positions of power. This is reality. Any functional system has to account for this. When I started this video, my intention was to talk about the governors of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, who all spoke together in opposition to unionizing automotive labor in their states, telling the people that joining the big automotive unions will surely drive away auto manufacturing to foreign countries and cost them their jobs. Not even a whisper from them about the desires of the people to receive better wages, receive better benefits, greater security in their labor positions. Nothing that reflects the interests of the people doing those jobs. Only that the companies are going to go overseas. And do you think those governors will do everything in their power to keep those companies right here in America where they're at? Or will they do as Ronald Reagan did and encourage them to go overseas, as to break up the power of organized unions? I think we already know the answer to that. And what's mind-boggling is we still have vast portions of Americans who believe these politicians are somehow operating on their behalf. We don't just have a few years of failed policy to look at, we have 50 years to look at. We have my entire lifetime and more of failed policy to look at for how did this scientific economic theory work out. And for anyone who jumps in here saying, well, you're just taking the side of the Democrats, that's not actually so. This is not about a side. My only side is that of the people. If you go back to the era of great prosperity, you will find that Republicans were often behind these same elements that generated great economic prosperity. And as we moved into Reaganomics, Democrats in nearly equal measure supported these same failed economic ideas. This came as a direct result of the big parties, the two big parties, becoming nothing more than the governmental branch of corporate America. To my libertarian friends, I'm not actually saying that the policies of the mid-1950s through mid-1970s were perfect. I actually believe we can do tremendously better. But that better is not going to be found by going farther down the failed path of Reaganomics. Libertarians talk about removing authoritarian government controls for economic prosperity. But Reagan didn't actually do that. He talked about it, but in practice, it was rather shifting the burden of government to a different class. Now, For any of you